All right, so we're recording. Okay, welcome to the Wealth Warriors Revolution. This is James Possible, and you can find me on Facebook, and my Facebook group is the Wealth Slaying Warriors, and we talk about subjects of wealth, money, and things related. So you can find me by going to startslaying.com, so www.startslaying.com. And I am continuing the conversation that I started with this podcast, and let me flip my screen here. The conversation is Black Voices, Black Wealth Matters. And in this conversation, I have a friend, Beverly Johnson, with me, and we're going to jump in here and have a conversation about money, wealth, Black America, and her experiences. So welcome, and thank you for being here, Beverly.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yes, very exciting. So is there a, when you think of money, right, and wealth, and you think of Black America, what comes to mind first for you?
The first thing, when you presented the topic, the first thing I thought about is when I was growing up. And I thought back to the dynamics in my neighborhood.
Okay.
And in my neighborhood, it was a small town called Pritchard, Alabama. And it's a little town that was created in 1925. And in that little area that we grew up in, there were all white business owners, even the person that ran the laundromat.
Okay.
All white in a all black town.
No, wait a second.
Leadership.
All black town, and
yes, it was like the demographics were primarily black.
Wow. Okay.
And in the town, in the little spot we had, the little grocery store ran by a white person. The pharmacy ran by a white person. The furniture store ran by a white person. And in that particular area, there was not a bank, but a check exchange. And what it was, you got paid. You converted your check over to cash, and you lived off that cash until it ran out after you paid your bills.
Okay.
So go ahead.
No bank?
So there was not a bank in our area.
Wow. Okay.
So in order to go to a bank, you either, if you didn't have a car, you would have to catch a bus to go to a bank, or if there was one near your job, you went there. Now, this was all before direct deposit was mandatory.
Sure.
So if you lacked transportation, your only option to cash your check was to go to the check exchange. And so you would walk around. So I knew people that walked around with their paycheck, in their entire paycheck, in their wallet. And so you lived out of your wallet until the money ran out. There was no such thing as, I need to go to the bank and put X amount for savings. There was not the person that said, I'm going to establish a CD. Even further, there was a little man, I don't even know his name, but he sold like quilts and blankets and stuff.
Okay.
And he would cash a lot of the elderly Social Security checks.
Okay.
So again, no banks. So you had this man that would literally, for all the retirees, you would sign your check over to him, and he would cash your check.
Okay, so was he white?
Yes.
Wow. Okay. So
the insurance person was white. The collections person were white. There was rarely a time where you saw an aspirational figure in your neighborhood.
Wow. Okay. That's a lot to take in. Now, on these checks, surely there were fees, right, for cashing the check?
Oh, yes, definitely. And at the time I was young, so I was not in that realm. So I'm sure the fees were astronomical on your checks.
Wow.
So because of where we lived in our little space, there was not a bank in walking distance.
Wow. Okay, that's wow. That what a story to tell. That's just amazing. So, um, now, how long did you live there until?
I lived in that spot until I graduated high school and went to college. And
Okay,
I remember when I came back, my first job was still in Pritchard, but I was in another part of town. And I remember my first paycheck, there was a Regions Bank right in walking distance. So after I would get my paycheck, I would walk to the bank and deposit my check and get my bus pass. That was my first introduction to banking
okay,
when I turned 18. That I established that was the first time I had a checking account. And then that's when it was like, okay. And so because no one else knew anything else about banking, it was you get a savings account.
right.
That's all you knew. You get a savings account.
Okay,
And that was it. I had a checking and a savings account.
okay. Now, okay, I want to make sure I understand now. Okay, so high school, you went to college,
Mm-hmm.
and then you came back to Pritchard.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and took a job,
Mm-hmm.
and then that's where the bank. That was your first account.
My first time exposure to a bank.
Okay,
Because again, my whole family at that time, they were still getting their checks cash. Even my mother
hold it,
was
hold it.
still,
So even with the bank there, they were still doing that.
yes, because then that shows how generationally traditions get passed on. Even my mom, with a job as an educator, was still getting her checks cashed. She would go to the bank and get her checks cashed.
That is, and I think you're right on point there, because that's definitely one of the things that I'm really focused on is, and I know you've heard the term, the generational trauma of the whole slavery and where we are today. And you don't just undo it automatically, right? You see, wow, yes, I just don't even know how to touch that. That's just, that's amazing. So did you ever talk to her about that, or?
Well, she had her own experience that led her to get a checking account.
Okay.
And so she did eventually get a checking account. And so it's one of those things, because again, I sat and I thought about this topic, the last few days. And I went back through my mind. And again, primarily all Black enclave still had systems where we were still under the control of whiteness, where if you had to go, like I remember there was the little grocery store. My grandmother was sitting me up there too. And she'd say, well, tell Mr. James, I want to get this on time.
Right.
I had no idea what that meant. I just remember standing there with my little groceries saying, Miss Mildred would like to put this on time. I didn't know she was getting it on credit.
Credit, right.
I had no idea what that meant. So right. I'm just this little 10-year-old girl coming back home with groceries that she bought on time.
Wow. Wow, that's amazing. Okay, so what about land and home ownership and stuff? No, okay.
My grandparents owned their home.
Okay.
And then the little street that she was on, this is again Pritchard, this little street in Pritchard, Alabama, that was primarily all homeowners. And so that was pretty, my first time seeing that it was a working class neighborhood. So primarily everybody on that street would leave and go to work with the proverbial lunchbox every morning, and they come back home, and I would say 80% of those in that little area own their own homes.
Okay. Okay. And they were, in fact, the Black community, correct? Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Wow. Okay. So tell me more. I'm not really sure where to go from here, because that's, I mean, as you go, so you went to college, and I'm curious, so your time in college, because that's a completely different experience, yes?
It was, because when I graduated, I came up here to Huntsville, Alabama. And again, I went to a primarily black school. So I will say, even though my grandparents lived in Pritchard, my family lived in another part of Mobile,
Okay.
which was primarily white.
Okay.
And I will say that when my mom moved us from that part of town to the west, was called West Mobile, that was my first time seeing that there were two separate worlds. That was like my first time seeing, like, wait a minute, your schools have stuff that mine didn't have. You all have resources that weren't poured into our neighborhood. So that was really my first time where I got to see a stark difference in how we were living.
So you were consciously thinking those things?
It was barely obvious, because I remember the middle school I went to, again, it was primarily black. And I noticed the access to books, access to field trips. The field trips were like few and far between. The access to information and speakers that we would have, few and far between. Now I go to the other side of town in the same city, 15 minutes away, and I'm being exposed to computer labs. I'm being exposed to field trips. I'm being exposed to the pre-law club, the pre-med club, all this stuff that was never mentioned on the other side of town that I lived on.
Wow. That's, yeah, you're right. Stark difference, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, seeing that and experiencing that, what does that change internally?
It was culture shock, where you go from being in a space where everybody looks like you and we're all striving and believing. Then now I'm in the 7th grade being called the N-word by this little boy because I won't share the answers to my test. And when that happened, I didn't know what to do with it. I was just sitting there like, did he just really call me the N-word?
Right.
Because I won't cheat on my, and I was just like, wow. So that was really my first instance of racism.
Wow.
To go from being where I was excelling with my peers and being pushed by my teachers to now I'm in a space where I'm the only black person in AP English, the only one in this setting. And now I'm not only am I the only one, but I'm being ostracized by those in the classroom.
Wow, I'm intrigued because you shared that was your first time, mm-hmm. Exposure to racism, and I guess the question that's in my mind right now is that in Pritchard, like every business was a white-owned business, and so race never really came to the fore for you in that experience?
I think growing up at the time, because again, I was little Beverly at the time,
right,
where I was not consciously aware that a system had been put in place for an all-black enclave where black entrepreneurship was not encouraged.
Right.
And I look back at it in this lens, and that's heartbreaking that you had outsiders come into this town and become rich off of citizens that should have been placed in positions of empowerment.
Right.
And so, with my grandparents, and again, this is the deep, deep South. It was almost, because we're accustomed to it, you go along to get along.
Yeah.
I'm not going to challenge it because you have resources that I need, and I need to stay in your good graces to get that resource.
Wow. That's, yeah. So the interesting thing you said, because you clearly called them outsiders. So is that to say that those business owners actually lived elsewhere?
Yes, they did not live in Pritchard. They were not residences of Pritchard. They would come from other parts of Mobile, or another part of the county. So they literally would drive in, collect our resources, and then take their resources back to their community.
Wow. Yeah. So this is like in the previous discussion, Black Wall Street came up. How familiar with that are you? So
I thought about that, and I also thought about Rosewood.
Yes. Okay. Now the only reason Black Wall Street's coming up is because the circulation of the dollar within that community.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I've read different accounts, but on the upside, it's been estimated that once the dollar came into the community, it changed hands at least 100 times before it left the community. And then here we are in Pritchard. It doesn't, the money's changing hand once and it's gone.
Mm-hmm. Because in that little space that my grandmother lived on Thomas Avenue, you could literally go from the check exchange on one spot, then you walk a quarter mile to the little grocery store that if you had your groceries on time, you had to pay him off. And then you walk another third of a mile, and if you had your furniture that you were paying on, you had to pay him. So in the space of less than a mile, you were giving out probably half your paycheck.
Yeah, if not more.
Right.
And wow, and the system literally, physically was built that way.
Yes.
Wow. Okay, so your how many generations of your family live there?
Oh, my whole family is still in Mobile.
Okay, but in Pritchard?
Right now, there's none of us are left in Pritchard. Okay. After my grandparents passed, my mom, she opted to remain in the part of Mobile that she was in.
Okay, okay. So really it was your grandparents that brought you to Pritchard?
It was their home. And so this is the life before daycare and aftercare. So that's the spot I went to after school and during the summers while my mom worked.
Okay. All right. Okay. That makes sense. Yeah. Wow. Okay. So now tell me more about Rosewood. What were your thoughts there?
You know, my thoughts of Rosewood, for me, I always remember, because I remember seeing the movie. And I remember they had the scene when they broke into the house and said, this N-word has a piano.
Right.
It says, what's the problem? You can't even play a piano. And he says, it doesn't matter. He has one. And it always stuck in my mind that we're often told to pull ourselves up by the bootstraps. Make it happen. You need to take it's always personal accountability, personal responsibility. But then the moment you see a community start to rise, there's a Rosewood, there's a Tulsa incident, then you come in and destroy the very thing that a community is working to build. And then you pull out that same narrative. See, we always have to take care of those people.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, because I'm wow, yeah. Because it's hard for me to fathom that this massacre is happening, and in the middle of this, that they're actually looting these buildings before they burn them down, and I just, I just can't wrap my head around that, and yet we know it's true, right? That trauma, that those stories, those type of things, were they ever a part of your life in your youth or not? Did you ever?
We had no knowledge of any of that.
Okay.
We had no idea those things were happening because I think a lot of it is that when you're in a working class neighborhood and you're getting your check cashed at a check exchange, you're literally keeping your head down in color.
Right.
You're just trying to do what you can do to get to the next paycheck, because savings isn't an option. If you lose your job, going and cashing out a CD is not an option. So when you're living in that type of reality, you don't have time to focus on anybody else.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate because you're so young. So the area of Pritchard where you had the black ownership of the homes and stuff, I wonder really how they were valued and how the kind of what premiums they paid on that time pay. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. And I thought about that too, where with the little furniture store that was right there, what was the interest rate that because I'm almost certain they were being gouged.
I can't imagine.
Because I'm sure financial literacy, they knew that you're dealing with a group of people that were not financially literate. And that if you had an option to go to another furniture store, you wouldn't have been an option.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And even, that's maybe a little segue here, but it's one of the things that strikes me about politics. I think that a well-intentioned person who has lived well, when you get into a system that does have that corruption around
Mm-hmm.
it, and you're in it long enough, it does start to affect you.
Mm-hmm.
And so even if maybe one of those owners, those store owners, had that kind of feeling, and I don't know, I'm
Mm-hmm.
just suggesting that once in it, that no doubt that their thoughts would change, their emotions would change, they would become detached from what they actually charged.
Mm-hmm.
Because surely they had conversations with the other owners, and I'm sure they compared notes and talked about things as you would expect from any business community, right? So yeah, that's just unfortunate.
It really is. And again, looking at life through the lens of now an adult, it is very unfortunate to be in a space, again, a primarily Black enclave with very limited